All right, so for this section, we are covering the French Revolution. Let me make that bigger. All right, so the French Revolution lasted from 1700 to 1830. The French Revolution changed the world. It overthrew the monarchy that was previously held in France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, and it destroyed the widespread privileges of a parasitic aristocracy. So remember, we said the aristocracy are the rich elites or the nobles. It introduced a certain amount of democracy into the parliamentary government, which is something that will be created a little bit later. It created conditions for the generation of new wealth and a class of nouveau rich. And then, using propaganda and revolutionary armies, it spread their innovations to the rest of Europe and the world. So we will look at the empire under Napoleon and the removal of the aristocracy and, well, not the aristocracy, the removal of the monarchy. So the old order before the revolution, they had the late 1700s, there was an absolute monarchy that still ruled France. If you remember, the absolute monarchy means that they are absolute in power. They control all three executive, legislative, judicial powers in one branch. Therefore, they are and they're kind of under that same dictatorship branch. Okay, so an autocracy. France and the French aristocracy were the trendsetters in Europe. This is where like the center of the culture was. Most people in France did not enjoy the lifestyles of the French aristocracy, however, because a lot or most of the people living in France at the time were kind of the peasant class. Louis XIV is the Sun King. He literally thought that everything revolved around him. He reigned for 72 years. He built the Palace of Versailles, which was outside of Paris. He made the nobles or the aristocracy live there because he wanted to control them. He was harsh towards the Huguenots or the Protestants, and if you remember, he repealed the Edict of Nantes, and many of these Protestants immigrated to the Netherlands, England, or the American colonies as a result, because he was not friendly with Protestants. What happens is it actually weakens the French economy because once you push out people who own or have the wealth, then the economy will suffer. Louis XIV also taxed the poor for the benefit of the rich. So what was happening is he was taxing the poor and the money was going to the rich. He spent money on lavish lifestyles and wars. You have the War of Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War. What this does, it sets the stage for the French Revolution, where the people are going to actually revolt. Now, there were problems in France. First, you had three different class levels in France. You had the first estate, which was the Catholic clergy. They only paid 1% of the taxes. The second estate, the nobility, paid 2% of the taxes. Those are the rich aristocrats. And the third estate, which are the peasants, the bourgeoisie, they paid 97% of the taxes. The taxes were very high for this group of people. On top of the high taxes they paid to the government, they also had to pay a church tax known as a tithe and a tale, which was a land tax. So the land was not really theirs. The government was in debt, so the king taxed the first and second estate. Now we also have the Estates General, which were delegates that represent each estate. They wanted to weaken the king's power and take over the government. Who had they recently watched do this? They got their inspiration from the Americans during the American Revolution and their separation from Great Britain. What was unfair about the way the Estates General was set up? First of all, the third estate had 97% of the people, so they should have more power, but they didn't. Okay, all the power was held in the hands of the absolute monarch and some in the clergy and the nobles. So they created a National Assembly. It was created because the Third Estate was locked out of the Estates General, and they wanted to create a constitution because they wanted rights to the people. Whose example do they follow? England and America, with the English Civil War and also the American Revolution. The Bastille is raided. If you remember, I told you what you need to know about the Bastille. This was the armory. Okay, the Third Estate. They raided the Bastille because they wanted weapons to defend themselves from the royal troops. Colonel Allen West said that if you are a citizen, if you are armed, you are a citizen. If you are unarmed, you are a subject. One more time. If you are armed, you are a citizen. If you are unarmed, you are a subject. Okay? The people knew that in order for them to be looked at as citizens, in order for them to know that they had rights or were deserving of rights, they had to defend themselves against a tyrannical government, which is what they did. Why the Bastille? It represents the corruptness of France and the power of the king. The results of this, it caused great fear. People start to panic. The revolution begins. Feudalism, the system that they had been under for so long, it dies. Okay, the nobles then have to give up power. They also agree to be taxed, and there's no more feudal dues that they have to pay towards their noble. The revolution begins. King Louis XIV refuses to give up power. The people want more power, and then chaos erupts across France. What this does, though, it also increased food shortages. The royal family is then imprisoned. Some are even killed. They storm the Palace of Versailles. The National Convention is what results from this, and where they would try to create a constitution. Every man is given the right to vote. Now, keep in mind, it literally says every man. Okay. The fate of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, that's where we get the term off with their heads, and they are killed or assassinated, I guess you should say. Should the revolution continue? The Sans-Culottes said yes. The Jacobins, no. Robespierre, he was the ruthless leader of the Jacobins, and Girondist, no, the war had gone far enough. So these were just different groups that were within this revolution or within the French people. Why should other countries, or why would other countries fight? They were worried that revolutions may spread to their country, and it also creates more panic and warfare. So the Reign of Terror the Reign of Terror lasted from July 1793 to July 1794. There were 17,000 killed, mostly commoners. Executions of those, or these people were mostly killed because they were trying to, they were against the revolution. Now the Jacobins, they wanted to defeat all opposition in France. So anybody who was opposed to the revolution, they wanted to kill them. Now you have Robespierre versus Danton. These were pretty prominent figures within French Revolution. Danton wants an end to the killings. Robespierre accuses him of disloyalty. Ultimately, Danton and his followers are executed, and then Robespierre increases the terror, and he is also executed. They hold a convention where they write a new constitution in 1795. Under this constitution, only propertied citizens can vote, which means that if you held property or if you legally owned property, then you could vote. But again, this is going to be a problem because the peasants at this point do not own property. It all is part of under this estate system. Even though feudalism is gone, the peasants still do not own land, so therefore they are not able to vote. The government is then brought under the control of the wealthy middle class. So you've still left out a whole group of people. Next, we have the Directory, which is an executive council of 5 men who take over rule of France. And this is known as an oligarchy, which is still under that authoritarian dictatorship kind of idea here. Under this Directory system that they have, they add a bicameral legislature, which is a 2-house legislature. So you're kind of seeing this formation of parliament. It rules from 1795 to 1799. They use the army to squelch uprisings from royalists and sans-culottes. Now, there's problems with the Directory. There's a growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the country is near bankruptcy. The Council of 5 also has moral scandals, so each of these people kind of have their own little issues. The French people see only recourse in the army. After the Directory, a 2-house legislature was established. Still, there are many problems, and so ultimately they look to the military to fix it. And unfortunately, whenever you leave things to the military, you're going to have, the leader of the military will probably come in and stage a coup, which is what happens here. Napoleon Bonaparte was a dictator. He took over in a coup d'etat, and this was a quick overthrow of the French government. That is Napoleon. He was kind of a short man. Napoleon saw himself as an emperor. So if you remember the emperors from Roman history, okay, or Greek history. So what Napoleon will do is he will kind of set himself up in a way, since it's an oligarchy, which we can compare to Roman history, The consuls were kind of like your presidents or your lead executives, like the executive branch, okay? Because even Roman history had a legislature. So he is very authoritative. He controlled most of Europe from France to Russia by 1812. And when I say authoritative, wow, authoritarian, which means he is very controlling, he is ruthless, he likes his power. As consul, as this kind of leader or head dictator of the government, he establishes public schools. He actually fights for or provides freedom of religion. He creates a Napoleonic Code, which is a clear and concise law system that helps to bring order to France. As consulate, in 1799, Napoleon establishes a new constitution and dictatorship. Originally, there were 3 consuls, but Napoleon is considered the first consul, which means like he's the leader of those, which is still an oligarchy at this point. It's a dictatorship, but it's still an oligarchy. Napoleonic reforms, he restructures the government. He pushes for education of the people of France. He also creates the Bank of France and universal taxation system. Ultimately, what this does, it slows inflation and high prices, although eventually they will, be bankrupt. In 1802, Napoleon changes things. He makes himself consul for life, okay, which is what Julius Caesar did, and ultimately, Hitler makes himself, the emperor or the person leader in charge. It says by popular vote, so the people voted for him. But it's funny because they, had a revolt to get rid of the monarchy. The Emperor of France, that is his new position. He moves the democracy that they had just fought for to an empire in 5 years by 1804. The Napoleonic Code that he pushed for, it was mostly written by Napoleon and his advisors, and it's based on the principles of natural law that we saw from John Locke and this Enlightenment era. It made French law more consistent, but it did not give universal suffrage, which is the right to vote. Also, women still had very little rights in French society. The Concordat of 1801, this was an agreement with the church. It created peace with the church and offered religious toleration. Napoleon becomes a world conqueror. By 1812, Napoleon controls most of Europe, and he is quoted as saying, "Power is my mistress." He was stopped by the British at the Battle of Trafalgar. He tried to destroy England with the economic warfare because he tried to cut them off as far as trade goes. He refused to trade with Great Britain, and this ultimately leads to the War of 1812. All right, so like I was saying, Napoleon, the world conqueror, we went through all of this. This all leads to the War of 1812 because of the beef between France, or the France's empire, and Great Britain. So one of the things that occurred during this time, we have nationalism, and I just want to clarify, nationalism in itself is not a bad thing. When it becomes a version of extreme nationalism is when it's a problem. But this idea of nationalism, feeling your country is the best and wanting self-rule, this also encourages people to embrace their own culture of their country. It's just pride in your country. The problem is when you want to now then take over other countries in the name of your empire, that's a problem, okay? 2 countries see the issue that Napoleon is becoming and the French Empire is becoming, and they help stop Napoleon. However, these are also 2 empires in themselves, so, it's kind of like just they don't want one other person to be at the top. So Russia and Great Britain step in. The scorched earth policy, this is when land is burned. So they use the scorched earth policy to keep people from using the land or keep the invaders from using the land, so the land can never be used again. Napoleon is then exiled to Elba because the French monarchy had been restored. However, he is later reinstated, and it only lasted 100 days. Napoleon is finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo between Great Britain. And then lastly, peace in Europe. You have Congress of Vienna. There they redraw the map of France and the empire. They also restore the monarchies of these countries that were taken over. And it forces changing Europe alliances and then ultimately the concert of Europe. And this is the end of French Revolution Notes.